What does it mean to live after death, when the world has mourned you, and your soul has known stillness? Good evening, dear friends, wherever you are resting tonight. Settle into your quiet space. Breathe gently and consider subscribing so these peaceful stories may continue accompanying your evenings each night. This is the tender and sorrow-tinged journey of Lazarus, the beloved friend of Jesus, whose resurrection bestowed profound grace, yet brought deep suffering, shaping a life lived under danger, wonder, and the mysterious closeness that draws a soul toward God. As the quiet memory of that opening question settles, the story drifts gently into its first chapter, where the soft hills of Judea cradle a village named Bethany, a place so small and humble that its dust rarely clings to the pages of history. Yet within its narrow paths and sun-warmed courtyards, a quiet life unfolded, the kind of life that rarely attracts attention, but forms the soil in which deep faith takes root. Here, in this peaceful corner, Lazarus was born into the household he would share all his life with his devoted sisters, Martha and Mary. Their days passed in modest rhythms, shaped by the rising of the sun, the tending of olive trees, the murmured prayers at dawn, and the gentle work of keeping a home that welcomed travelers who found themselves on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. Bethany was not a place of noise or ambition. It was a place of rest, of ordinary hours lived with sincerity, of neighbors who greeted one another with warmth because they understood the fragility and beauty of simple blessings. Lazarus grew into this world quietly, without seeking greatness, learning early the value of listening more than speaking, of offering a seat in the shade rather than striving to be seen. There was something contemplative in his nature, a softness that made him attentive to the feelings of others, especially to Martha's fierce sense of responsibility and Mary's tender inclination toward silence and reflection. Even as a child, Lazarus often found himself wondering about the mystery that lay beneath the ordinary, though he lacked the words to express it. There were moments, while watching the sunrise spill across the Mount of Olives or hearing distant travelers speak of the long-awaited Messiah, when he felt something stirring, a quiet invitation he could not yet understand. But Bethany was a place where time moved gently, asking nothing of him except to grow, to love, and to be present in the lives of those around him. His parents, though simple and pious, instilled in him a respect for the traditions of their people, teaching him the Psalms and the stories of deliverance, reminding him that the God of Israel often worked in silence long before revealing his wonders. Their teachings became the soft foundation of his later faith, shaping his heart long before he would meet the one who would call him friend. As the years passed, the three siblings formed a bond that carried the warmth of a small flame sheltered from wind. Martha, with her practical nature, ensured that the home was always ready to welcome others. Mary, with her reflective spirit, brought a sweetness and depth that softened every room she entered. And Lazarus, standing quietly between them, became the steady heart of the household. Their home was one of those places that seemed to breathe hospitality, where weary travelers found cool water, a loaf of bread, and the comfort of being seen and valued. This simple generosity echoed the ancient teachings of their faith, and though none of them imagined it then, it would one day offer refuge to the one who carried salvation in his very presence. In those early years, nothing hinted at the extraordinary path that lay ahead. Lazarus walked through the fields, tended the family land, and prayed in the synagogue with the humility of someone who never expected to be remembered beyond the boundaries of his village. Yet within him lived a sensitivity that made him receptive to grace, a quiet openness that would one day allow him to hear a voice calling him out of darkness. For now, though, he remained a young man shaped by calm days and gentle evenings, learning through the small joys and sorrows of Bethany what it meant to live faithfully. Sometimes, in moments of stillness, he felt an inexplicable longing, as if God were preparing his soul for something he could not yet name. But like many who sense the stirrings of destiny without understanding it, he simply returned to his tasks, trusting the rhythm of ordinary life. And so the story of Lazarus begins not with miracles, but with the grace of simplicity, with a childhood held in the hands of a quiet village and a loving family. It is a reminder that holiness often begins in silence, in unnoticed gestures, in hearts made tender through years of peaceful routine. As we linger here at the threshold of his journey, one might ask, how does an ordinary life become the vessel of an extraordinary grace that will one day shake the world? As the quiet memories of Lazarus's early years still linger like the fading warmth of a lamp at dusk, the story drifts gently into the next movement of his life, where the simplicity of Bethany begins to weave itself into something deeper and more mysterious. The rhythms of the village continued much as they always had. Children running through dusty paths, shepherds returning at sunset, the familiar murmur of prayer rising from humble homes. But somewhere within these familiar patterns, an invisible thread of grace was already approaching. It arrived first as a whisper carried by travelers, speaking of a teacher from Nazareth, whose words stirred hearts and opened the scriptures in ways no one had ever heard. Most dismissed such talk as they would any rumor carried along the roads. But for Lazarus, whose spirit had always leaned quietly toward wonder, the stories settled into him like seeds that had been waiting for the right season to bloom. The world was changing, softly but undeniably, and though he did not yet know it, his path was drawing slowly toward the one whose voice would one day call him out of the tomb. The first time Lazarus saw Jesus, it was not in a moment of spectacle or public teaching, but in the simple, unadorned light of a village afternoon. Jesus had come to Bethany accompanied by a few disciples, their feet dusty from travel, their expressions earnest yet tired. Martha, ever eager to welcome strangers, urged Mary and Lazarus to help her prepare food and water, insisting that hospitality was a duty blessed by God. When Jesus entered their home, the atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, not with thunder or awe, but with a quiet presence that made Lazarus's breath still for a moment. There was something profoundly gentle in Jesus's eyes, something that saw deeply without demanding or judging. Lazarus, who had always struggled to put his intuitions into words, found himself immediately at ease, as though the longing he had carried since childhood had suddenly found its answer without requiring explanation. What struck Lazarus most in those first moments was how Jesus interacted with his sisters. Martha, bustling with concern for the meal, received from Jesus not only gratitude, but a patient, affectionate understanding of her anxious heart. Mary, drawn to sit at his feet and listen, was met with a gaze that affirmed her desire to dwell in what was eternal rather than what was urgent. For Lazarus, watching from a quiet corner, this balance of truth and tenderness revealed something he had never seen in any teacher or rabbi. Jesus did not simply speak about God. He carried God's peace in his voice, his gestures, in the gentle gravity of his presence. And when Jesus turned his attention to Lazarus, something passed between them that needed no words. It was as if Jesus understood him completely, understood the quiet interior world Lazarus rarely shared, understood the attentive heart that had always sensed there was something more to life than the visible and the measurable. In the days that followed this first encounter, Jesus returned to Bethany several times, and each visit deepened the bond that was growing between them. Lazarus found himself drawn not only to Jesus' teachings, but to the very humanity of him. The way he laughed with his friends, the way he asked simple questions that opened profound truths, the way he looked at each person with the dignity of someone truly seen. The friendship that formed between them had none of the demands of formal discipleship. Lazarus did not follow Jesus from town to town as the 12 did, nor did he seek positions of honor. Instead, his home became a refuge, a place where Jesus could rest, eat, and simply be among friends who loved him without condition. During those early visits, Lazarus often found moments to walk with Jesus through the quiet edges of Bethany. These walks were not filled with grand teachings. They were peaceful, contemplative, shaped by a mutual understanding that conversation did not need to be constant for communion to be real. Jesus would point to a fig tree and speak of patience, or watch the shepherds gather their flocks and reflect on the tenderness of God's care. Lazarus listened, always attentive, always aware that these small gestures carried spiritual truths deeper than he could yet comprehend. What grew between them was not merely affection, but a profound spiritual attunement, a recognition that Jesus saw the world and every soul within it with a clarity Lazarus longed to imitate. Mary, too, sensed the depth of this friendship. She often watched the two men talk in the courtyard, her heart filled with a quiet joy. Martha, though always occupied with practical concerns, also recognized the blessing their home had received. She may not have understood all that Jesus taught, but she understood goodness, and she saw it radiating from him like light. Their home had become a place where the divine and the human met in the most ordinary of ways, over bread, over conversations, over silent moments of rest. Lazarus, without fully realizing it, was being prepared by these encounters. The tenderness of these early days would become a memory he carried even into the darkness that awaited him. As months passed, word of Jesus' miracles and teachings spread further, and his visits to Bethany became more precious, each one touched with a growing sense of significance. Lazarus observed how his friend carried the weight of his mission with humility, how he often withdrew to pray, how he bore the misunderstandings of religious leaders with patience. There were moments when Lazarus saw shadows of sorrow in Jesus' expression, hints of a burden known only to him. In those moments, Lazarus felt a protective tenderness rise within him, a desire to offer comfort even though he sensed he could never fully understand the mission Jesus carried. Still, his presence, his listening heart, his simple companionship, these offered Jesus a place of rest that no other village seemed to provide. It was during one of these quiet visits that Lazarus realized how deeply his life had become intertwined with Jesus's. While sitting beneath the olive trees, Jesus spoke softly of the Father's love, of the kingdom that was drawing near, of the courage required to trust in God even when the path grew dark. Lazarus listened, and something in him shifted. It was not a dramatic conversion, but a deepening, a quiet surrender. He realized that faith was not merely reciting prayers or fulfilling traditions, but allowing one's heart to be shaped by God's presence. His friendship with Jesus had awakened in him a longing to live more gently, more generously, more attuned to the quiet movements of grace. Yet even in these peaceful moments, an unspoken question hovered in the margins of Lazarus's thoughts. What would this friendship demand of him in the years to come? How would this bond with Jesus shape his destiny? He did not know, and perhaps he did not want to know. But he sensed that the tranquility of Bethany, the calm rhythm of his life, could not remain untouched by the growing storm around Jesus' ministry. Still, for now, he chose to rest in the moment, to savor the blessing of having known the gentle warmth of a friendship that would one day carry him through darkness deeper than any he had imagined. As we pause at this early flowering of their bond, one might ask, how does the quiet birth of a friendship become the doorway to a miracle that will echo through centuries? In the gentle stillness left by those early encounters, the story moves softly into another season of Lazarus's life. A season shaped not only by friendship, but by the deepening rhythm of ministry unfolding all around him. As Jesus' name began to spread through Judea, Bethany slowly became a place where the sacred and the ordinary mingled in quiet harmony. Travelers now spoke not only of rumors, but of wonders, of lepers healed, of storms calmed, of teachings that touched the heart more deeply than the strict interpretations taught in the synagogues. Lazarus listened with growing awe, not as one who admired from a distance, but as someone who knew the teacher's voice, who had shared meals with him, who had witnessed firsthand the serenity and compassion that underlay his every action. The growing ministry did not change Lazarus's affection for Jesus. Rather, it deepened his sense of reverence, as though he were beginning to understand that the man he called friend was unveiling the mysteries of God in ways the world was only beginning to perceive. Bethany, with its quiet hills and humble dwellings, offered Jesus a refuge from the pressures of the crowds. And in that refuge, the family of Lazarus became like a small but faithful hearth fire that warmed the edges of his mission. Martha, ever practical, found joy in tending to Jesus' needs, seeing her work as a way of honoring the one she believed carried the Spirit of God more intimately than any prophet before him. Mary, drawn deeply to listening and contemplation, seemed to understand Jesus in a tender and spiritual way, sensing the sorrow hidden beneath his serenity. Lazarus stood between them, not torn, but balanced, offering the companionship of someone who simply loved Jesus for who he was, not for the signs he performed or the authority he carried. Theirs was a friendship rooted in presence, not expectation. As Jesus' visits grew more frequent, the quiet household in Bethany became something of a resting place for his disciples as well. Lazarus grew to know them, Peter with his passionate zeal, John with his contemplative soul, Thomas with his earnest questioning. Each brought a different facet of the early church that Jesus was forming, though none of them yet understood the magnitude of what they participated in. Lazarus, with his gentle disposition, often listened to their conversations with quiet attentiveness, absorbing the wonder and tension that accompanied following Jesus across towns and villages. He admired their courage, though he did not envy their constant travel or the weight of being visible companions to a man attracting both devotion and hostility. In these days, the emotional heart of Lazarus's life was found in the quiet moments when Jesus would sit in the courtyard after a long journey, his voice softened by fatigue, but still carrying the gentle authority that brought peace to all who heard him. Sometimes he spoke of the kingdom of God, of mercy that extended beyond boundaries, of forgiveness that restored even the most broken of hearts. At other times, he simply rested in silence, and in those moments his exhaustion revealed the humanity that his miracles often overshadowed. Lazarus cherished these glimpses into his friend's vulnerability, sensing that even the Son of Man needed spaces where he could be simply a man among friends. The household flourished in this sacred companionship, each visit leaving behind a memory that glowed like a lamp against the shadows of the growing world around them. Martha's bustling energy softened under Jesus' understanding gaze. Mary's contemplative spirit deepened in his presence, and Lazarus himself found his heart slowly reshaped by grace. He was learning that holiness did not come through sudden transformation, but through quiet openness, through living each day with a readiness to welcome God into one's ordinary reality. Jesus taught him this more by presence than by words, revealing that divine love could dwell within the simple acts of offering bread, sharing conversation, extending hospitality. Yet beneath the comfort of these moments, something else was stirring. Something neither Lazarus nor his sisters could fully articulate. They sensed, in the way travelers spoke, in the murmurs of the Pharisees, in the growing crowds that followed Jesus, that his ministry was becoming more than a movement. It was becoming a challenge to the established order. There were whispers of confrontations in Jerusalem, of leaders who grew uneasy at the authority with which Jesus spoke, of a tension that seemed to rise with each miracle and each proclamation of God's mercy. Lazarus noticed how Jesus sometimes paused, as though listening to a voice only he could hear, and how his expressions shifted with a solemnity that hinted at approaching trials. Still, Jesus returned to Bethany whenever he could, and in those visits the tensions of the outside world seemed to fade for a time. The simple meals shared under the open sky, the laughter exchanged with disciples, the quiet walks through the olive grove, these remained unshaken by the mounting pressures. Lazarus treasured each of these moments, though he did not yet understand their prophetic significance. He did not know that the very ordinary life he cherished was preparing him for a miracle that would soon plunge his name into the heart of a divine mystery. There were evenings when Jesus lingered a little longer, speaking softly of trust, of carrying one another's burdens, of the Father's love that held all creation. Lazarus listened, feeling these teachings carve themselves deeper into his soul. He began to understand that friendship with Jesus was not merely a blessing. It was a calling, an invitation to enter a relationship that would demand courage, surrender, and a willingness to be reshaped by divine love. Yet nothing in these moments suggested the suffering that would soon unfold. Lazarus only felt gratitude, a gratitude that filled him with a peace so steady and gentle that he could not imagine its absence. As Jesus' ministry grew, so did Lazarus' faith. He found himself more drawn to prayer, more aware of the quiet movements of the Spirit, more willing to pause and reflect on the ways God might be working in his life. He noticed how Mary sat more often in contemplation, how Martha softened her constant labor with deeper trust, how even the conversations between the three siblings took on a gentler tone. Jesus had changed their home, not with grand declarations, but with the simple holiness of his presence. Yet even as these blessings unfolded, Lazarus sometimes sensed a faint tremor beneath his peace, as though life were holding its breath. He did not fear this feeling. Rather, he accepted it with a curiosity shaped by faith. It seemed to whisper that the path ahead would not remain as gentle as the early days, that friendship with the Messiah might one day require more than hospitality and companionship. But for now, Lazarus allowed himself to rest in the quiet goodness of the present moment, trusting that God's timing would reveal what he needed to know when the moment came. And so, as this chapter closes, one is left to wonder, how does a home, shaped by simple love and routine, become the sanctuary where divine friendship blossoms into a mystery that will soon shake the world? As the warmth of those early years lingers like the last glow of an evening lamp, the story moves gently into a more somber season, one shaped not by the quiet routine of hospitality, but by an unexpected shadow that began to settle over the household of Bethany. Though life continued with its familiar rhythms, Martha rising before dawn to prepare bread, Mary tending to the small garden behind the house, Lazarus walking the narrow paths that wound through the olive groves. There was a subtle change in the air, a heaviness that none of them could name at first. Lazarus had always been steady, his health strong, his spirit calm, but in these days a faint weariness began to follow him like a distant echo. At first it appeared only in small moments, a slowing of his steps at the end of the day, a quiet sigh he could not explain, a brief pause when climbing the hill toward the village well. His sisters noticed, though they did not speak of it openly. They hoped it was nothing more than the fatigue of early spring or the lingering effect of seasonal fevers that sometimes passed through Judea. Yet beneath their silence lay a shared unease that grew with each passing day. Lazarus himself tried to ignore the first signs of illness, unwilling to trouble his sisters or cause unnecessary worry. He continued his tasks, reassured neighbors that he was simply tired, and brushed off Mary when she paused too long to study his face. But the fatigue deepened, settling into his bones with a weight that refused to lift. The mornings became harder, the nights restless. There were times when he would wake to find the room spinning gently, as if the world no longer held him with the solidity it once had. Still, he offered calm smiles, choosing not to burden those he loved, even as his strength quietly slipped away. It was Martha who first spoke openly of her concern. One afternoon, as Lazarus rested in the shade of the courtyard, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to sip water, she knelt beside him with the firmness of a woman accustomed to caring for her family. She placed her hand on his forehead, checked the pulse in his wrist, watched his breathing with the sharp eyes of someone who had tended to many fevers in her life. Yet the sickness troubling Lazarus seemed unlike the ordinary illnesses she had witnessed. There was no clear symptom to grasp, no simple remedy to prepare. It was as though his vitality were slowly ebbing away for reasons that eluded understanding. Mary, more contemplative by nature, sensed the spiritual weight of the moment even before the physical symptoms became undeniable. She saw in Lazarus's eyes a tiredness that came not only from the body, but from someplace deeper, a quiet resignation that frightened her more than any fever. Often she sat beside him in silence, praying softly, asking for God's mercy, her heart pierced by the fear of losing the brother who had been the gentle anchor of their home. She found herself remembering Jesus' teachings, clinging to his words about trust, about the Father's love, about the promise that God saw every sorrow. Yet the more she prayed, the more she longed for Jesus himself to be there, to lay his hands upon Lazarus, to speak healing with the quiet authority that had restored so many others. It was Martha who finally voiced what both sisters were thinking. Standing near the door, her voice trembling despite her strength, she said, "We must send for him." Mary agreed at once. They had seen Jesus heal the blind, cleanse the afflicted, restore the broken. They believed with a conviction born of love that he could save Lazarus as well, and so a messenger was sent, carrying their plea across the dusty roads toward the place where Jesus was teaching. "Lord, the one you love is ill." The message was simple, yet filled with the weight of their hope. They believed that the moment Jesus heard it, he would come, for he loved Lazarus deeply. But when the messenger returned, Lazarus had worsened, and Jesus had not yet arrived. The sisters waited anxiously, scanning the horizon each day, listening for footsteps, praying that every approaching traveler might be him. Lazarus himself remained calm, though the exhaustion had grown so profound that speaking required effort. There were moments when he squeezed Mary's hand, offering a faint smile as if to reassure her, even though the weakness was clearly overtaking him. He thought often of Jesus in these moments, not with fear, but with a quiet trust that whatever God allowed would not be without purpose. He remembered their long conversations, the warmth of their friendship, the gentle authority in Jesus' gaze. Yet even as these memories comforted him, his breath grew shallower, his strength faded more quickly. Martha, in her grief, struggled with the silence of Jesus' absence. She paced the house, her heart torn between faith and fear. "Why has he not come?" she whispered more than once, her voice breaking with emotion she rarely allowed herself to express. Mary remained close to Lazarus, praying quietly, her tears falling unnoticed. She felt no anger, only sorrow, a sorrow rooted in love and the helplessness of watching her brother fade like the last light of a sunset. As the illness deepened, Lazarus's world grew dimmer. There were times when he drifted in and out of consciousness, hearing his sisters' voices as though from a great distance. He felt the warmth of Mary's hand on his, the trembling of Martha's voice as she whispered his name, the soft breeze entering through the window carrying the scent of olive leaves. Everything familiar seemed to slip gently from his grasp. In those moments of drifting, he found himself reflecting on the life he had lived, its simplicity, its peace, its unexpected blessing of friendship with Jesus. He felt no bitterness, only a deep trust and a surrender that came not from despair, but from faith in the God who had guided every quiet moment of his life. The day came when Lazarus could no longer rise from his bed. His breathing slowed, each breath a fragile effort. Martha stood on one side of him, Mary on the other, their hands clasping his, their whispered prayers blending with their tears. They continued to hope for Jesus, even as the shadows of death crept closer. Yet as the sun lowered beyond the hills, Lazarus released his final breath with a peaceful exhale, his face softening, his body growing still. The moment was marked not by fear, but by a profound stillness that filled the room like a quiet blessing. Mary and Martha collapsed into one another's arms, their grief pouring out in sobs that echoed through the house. The villagers came to mourn with them, bringing spices and linens, helping to prepare Lazarus's body for burial. The sisters clung to tradition, covering his face, wrapping him gently, and walking with trembling steps behind the men who carried him to the tomb carved into the rock. The stone was rolled into place with a heavy finality, sealing the quiet darkness that now held their brother. And as the dust settled, so did the weight of their sorrow, deep and unrelenting. As we rest at this moment of profound grief, one cannot help but wonder, what happens to faith when the miracle we prayed for does not arrive in time? As the weight of Lazarus's passing settles heavily over Bethany, the story moves gently, yet inevitably, into the deep twilight that follows death, into that sacred stillness where grief and faith meet in trembling silence. The village that had once brimmed with the soft noises of daily life now carried a hush, as though the olive trees themselves bowed their branches in mourning. Mary and Martha walked through these days as though through a dream made of shadows, their hearts hollowed by the sudden absence of the brother who had been the grounding presence of their home. Every corner of the house seemed to remember him. The chair he favored in the courtyard, the clay cup he used each morning, the quiet path he walked between their garden and the village well. Each memory pressed against their hearts with the weight of love that can no longer be given, only mourned. The days of mourning in Judea followed ancient rhythms, and the sisters clung to these traditions because they offered a structure to grief that otherwise would have overwhelmed them. Friends and neighbors arrived with fragrances meant to soothe the air, with bread for the mourners, with prayers recited in hushed tones. Yet even these gestures, kind though they were, could not ease the ache that pulsed within Mary and Martha. They had believed so firmly that Jesus would come in time, that his presence would change the course of Lazarus's suffering, that the illness which baffled them could not stand before his power. And yet the hours had passed, the sun had risen and fallen, and their brother's life had slipped away before the teacher arrived. This absence, this silence, became a second grief layered atop the first, not born of anger, but of bewilderment and sorrow. Lazarus's body, tenderly wrapped with spices, rested now in the tomb carved into the hillside, a place chosen because it lay close to the village, yet offered the solitude appropriate for the dead. The tomb was cool, dark, and solemn, its interior carved by hands from generations past who had also known grief. When the stone was rolled across the entrance, it sealed not only Lazarus's physical remains, but the chapter of life that Mary and Martha had shared with him. For them, the stone felt like a punctuation of terrible finality, a barrier between what had been and what would never be again. Every sunrise that followed seemed somehow colder, every evening more lonely, for the presence that had once warmed their home had been taken from them, and the world no longer felt the same. Mary, always sensitive to the spiritual threads of life, retreated quietly into contemplation, spending long hours in the corner of the home, where she used to sit near Jesus when he visited. Her prayers were soft and broken, filled with supplications that trembled between trust and sorrow. She did not question God's goodness, yet she could not help but wonder why one whom Jesus loved so deeply had been allowed to die before his arrival. Her tears fell silently, soaking the earth at her feet, mingling with whispered psalms she recited from memory, the same psalms their mother had taught them as children. Her grief was tender, shaped by love too deep to be expressed in words. Martha, though equally heartbroken, expressed her mourning differently. She busied herself with tending to guests, arranging food, tidying the house, and ensuring that the customs of mourning were observed correctly. This activity, though outwardly practical, was her way of holding her heart together, of preventing the collapse that hovered at the edges of her strength. She moved with mechanical determination, but inside she felt a quiet storm gathering, a mixture of sorrow, confusion, and the ache of hopes that had dissolved into dust. Though she did not voice it openly, she carried a deep longing to see Jesus, to ask him why he had delayed, to hear from his lips some explanation that would comfort her wounded faith. In the midst of this mourning, the community of Bethany gathered around the sisters, offering support in gestures both small and significant. Women sat with Mary, keeping vigil over her tears. Men came to Martha with words of respect for Lazarus, recalling his kindness and humility. Yet among these expressions of sympathy, there was also an undercurrent of whispers, murmured questions about Jesus, the teacher who had been so close to this family. Some wondered why he had not come sooner, why he had allowed one of his closest friends to die. These whispers did not carry malice, but they revealed the fragile hope that many had placed in Jesus' power. If even Lazarus could die without intervention, what did it mean for the others who looked to Jesus with expectation? For Mary and Martha, these murmurs cut deeply, not because they doubted Jesus' goodness, but because they felt the sting of unanswered hopes. They had believed with all their hearts that Jesus would come, that he would lay his hand on Lazarus's brow, that the illness would flee at his command. They had imagined the relief of seeing their brother rise from his bed, smiling once more, restored by the presence that had brought healing to so many others. but the image remained only in imagination. Reality had carved a different path, one that forced them to walk through the valley of grief, with only faith to guide them. Days passed. The house grew quieter. The fragrance of spices faded from the air. The mourning rituals continued, but their intensity softened into a deep, lingering sorrow that no custom could alleviate. Mary continued to pray, her voice trembling in the stillness. Martha continued to serve, her hands moving with practiced familiarity. Yet beneath these actions lay the unspoken truth that both sisters carried like a hidden wound. Lazarus was gone. The man who had shared their childhood, who had laughed with them, who had welcomed Jesus into their home, who had lived with gentle humility. This brother had entered the silence of death, and they were left to navigate a world emptied of his presence. One morning, as Martha stood near the window, watching the sun rise over the Mount of Olives, she felt a sudden pull at her heart, a stirring she could not explain. It was as though the very air shifted, as though something long awaited had finally begun to approach. She did not know what it meant, but she felt it in the depths of her being. A subtle tremor, a whisper of hope that dared to surface even in the midst of sorrow. Mary, too, noticed a change in the atmosphere, a quiet stirring that made her lift her head from her prayer mat as though someone had spoken her name softly from afar. The villagers, still gathered in the house, also felt a shift. Conversations paused, faces turned toward the road. There was no sound yet, no visible sign, but something in the air suggested that the stillness of grief was about to be broken. The stone that sealed the tomb remained unmoved, its heavy weight pressing against the earth, a silent reminder of human finality. But in the tender space between sorrow and expectation, a question began to rise in the hearts of Mary and Martha, a question that had no answer yet, but that carried within it the faintest ember of hope. Could it be that death, though sealed by stone, did not have the final word? And so we pause here at the threshold of mourning and mystery, wondering what happens when divine footsteps draw near to a tomb the world has already accepted as closed. As the quiet longing in Bethany trembled on the edge of hope, the story moves gently into a moment where grief and divine compassion meet in a single breath, a moment when footsteps finally echo upon the road that leads to the mourning house. After days of sorrow, of prayers whispered through tears, of faces turned toward the horizon with a longing that deepened with each passing hour, someone at last saw a small gathering of men approaching from the direction of Judea. The travelers' garments were dusty, their pace steady but unhurried, and at their head walked a figure whom Martha recognized before she could even think, before her heart had time to guard itself against another disappointment. There, finally, was Jesus. His presence was unmistakable, not because of any grandeur or dramatic sign, but because Martha felt the air shift, felt her breath catch, felt a sudden and involuntary surge of emotion rise within her, like a wave breaking against the stones of her grief. The teacher had come. He had come too late to save Lazarus. This she believed with a certainty carved by sorrow. But he had come nevertheless, and that alone stirred something deep within her soul. Without hesitation, Martha left the house, her steps quickening along the dusty path. Mary remained inside, her head bowed in mourning, unaware that Jesus was near. But Martha, torn between love and anguish, approached him with the kind of honesty only grief can summon. When she reached him, her voice trembled with a painful blend of faith and sorrow. "Lord," she said, the words breaking through the silence like a fragile plea, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." It was not an accusation, though the pain behind the words was raw. It was the lament of a heart that had hoped with all its strength and now struggled to understand why its hope had not been fulfilled. Jesus looked at her with eyes that held both compassion and a depth of understanding beyond human measure. He did not chastise her sorrow, nor did he dismiss her words. Instead, he received them gently, allowing her grief to pour forth without interruption, as though her pain itself were a prayer. Martha continued, her voice softening as faith found its footing again. "But even now," she whispered, "I know that God will grant whatever you ask of him." These words, birthed from sorrow, yet lifted by trust, revealed the complicated dance within her soul, a tension between the finality of death and the lingering belief that Jesus carried with him a closeness to God, unlike anything she had ever known. Jesus listened, then spoke with a calm assurance that settled over her like a warm mantle. "Your brother will rise again." Martha nodded, interpreting his words through the lens of her faith. "I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." But Jesus was not speaking of distant prophecies. He looked into her eyes and spoke truth with a tenderness that carried the weight of eternity. "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though he dies." The words entered Martha's heart not as instruction, but as revelation. She felt their meaning without fully understanding it, felt their promise echo deep within her grief. When Jesus asked if she believed, she answered with renewed conviction, declaring him the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who had come into the world. At Jesus' request, Martha returned to the house to call Mary. Her voice shook as she leaned close to her sister and whispered, "The teacher is here, and he is asking for you." Mary rose at once, her mourning veil briefly falling from her shoulder as she hurried outside. Those gathered with her, thinking she was going to weep at the tomb, followed close behind. But Mary's steps carried her not toward the place of the dead, but toward the one whose presence had always brought her peace. The moment she saw Jesus, she fell at his feet, overwhelmed by grief too heavy for words. Through tears that blurred her vision, she echoed Martha's lament. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And then the silence fell, a silence steeped in sorrow, a silence that trembled with the weight of human pain. Jesus looked at Mary, saw the anguish in her trembling form, felt the sorrow radiating from those who had followed her, and something within him moved with a depth of compassion beyond what any of them could comprehend. He was troubled in spirit, not by doubt or fear, but by the sheer force of love that binds God to his creation, by the sight of grief that sin and death had stitched into the fabric of human life. He asked to be shown the place where Lazarus had been laid, and as they began to walk toward the tomb, surrounded by mourners, the moment arrived that would echo through the centuries. Jesus wept. It is impossible to overstate the magnitude of this moment. The Son of God, the one who held the power of life within his very being, allowed himself to enter fully into the sorrow of his friends. His tears were not a sign of helplessness. They were the tears of a God who chooses to draw near to human suffering, who does not remain distant from the pain of those he loves. In his weeping, the mourners glimpsed a divine tenderness that defied understanding. Some murmured, "See how he loved him." Others questioned his power, whispering, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept Lazarus from dying?" But Jesus did not respond to their doubts. His heart was set on something deeper, something that would soon unravel every assumption about life and death. The path to the tomb wound gently along the hillside, flanked by olive trees whose leaves shimmered in the late afternoon light. As they approached the place where Lazarus had been laid, The air grew cooler, the shadows longer. The tomb, carved into the rock, stood silent beneath the weight of the stone that sealed it. For Mary and Martha, this sight reopened the wound of their grief, pressing upon them the terrible finality of the burial rituals they had witnessed only days before. The mourners gathered behind them, their voices subdued, their steps hesitant, sensing that something profound and mysterious was unfolding. Jesus paused before the tomb, his face marked by the lingering traces of his tears. This moment was suspended between earthly sorrow and divine intention, a moment where heaven and earth seemed to hold their breath together. Mary clung to Martha, both sisters trembling at the nearness of the place where their brother lay. And Jesus, standing at the threshold of death's domain, prepared to reveal the depth of his identity in a way that would change everything, not only for Lazarus, but for all who would come to believe in him. And so we pause here, at the mouth of the tomb, wondering what happens when the one who weeps with humanity also carries the power to restore what has been lost to death. As the quiet breath of that moment lingers over Bethany, the story moves into the threshold where sorrow and impossible hope stand side by side, into the space where Jesus confronts the darkness of the tomb with a resolve that stills every heartbeat around him. The mourners, clustered behind Mary and Martha, watched as Jesus approached the sealed entrance of the rock-hewn chamber. The air felt strangely heavy, as though creation itself sensed something extraordinary drawing near. The stone, round and weighty, stood as a symbol of the finality humanity had always accepted, that death closes every chapter, silences every voice, ends every story. Yet before this immovable barrier, Jesus stood with the quiet authority of one who sees beyond human endings, whose gaze pierces through the darkness to the very heart of God's promise. Martha, ever attentive to practical realities even in moments of deep mystery, stepped closer to Jesus with trembling hands. Her voice, soft yet strained, rose in the stillness. "Lord, by now there will be a stench. He has been dead 4 days." The words carried not doubt, but a sister's tender concern, a reminder of the natural order that governed human experience. 4 days. In Jewish understanding, this was the threshold beyond which death was absolute. The soul, believed to linger near the body for a short time, had already departed. The body would have begun its irreversible decay. Lazarus was gone, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but truly gone. And yet Jesus, hearing Martha's fragile warning, looked at her with a calm that gently unraveled her fear. "Did I not tell you," he said, his voice both soft and steady, "that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" Those words hovered in the air, settling into Martha's heart like a seed planted in the soil of grief. Something in her softened, her resistance melting into a trembling obedience. She nodded to the men standing nearby, and with hesitant steps they began to roll away the stone. The grinding of rock against rock echoed through the hillside, a sound that seemed to shake the silence of death itself. Mary clung to her sister, tears slipping down her cheeks, her breath caught between fear and hope. The mourners held their breath. Even the birds in the trees seemed to quiet, as though all of creation waited to see what God would do. When the stone was finally moved aside, a deep, cool darkness lay exposed before them. The interior of the tomb was silent, heavy with the weight of death. The air carried the faint scent of burial spices mingled with the unmistakable stillness of a body long laid to rest. Into this darkness, Jesus lifted his eyes toward heaven. His prayer was simple, intimate, spoken not as a request, but as a humble acknowledgement of the Father's constant unity with him. "Father, I thank you for hearing me," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of certainty. "I know that you always hear me, but I say this for the sake of those standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." His words were not for the dead, but for the living. An invitation for every watching heart to step into the light of divine truth. Then came the moment that ripples across centuries, the moment that reveals the depth of Christ's power and the tenderness of his love. Jesus stepped closer to the opening of the tomb, his voice rising not in thunder but in commanding clarity, filled with authority woven through compassion. "Lazarus," he called, "come forth." These 3 words, simple yet unimaginable, carried through the darkness like a beam of light, piercing the deepest shadows. They were not merely spoken to the still body within the tomb. They were spoken to death itself, spoken to the silence that had claimed Lazarus, spoken to the boundary separating life from eternity. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world held still, suspended between despair and miracle. And then, from within the darkness, a faint sound, soft, hesitant, impossible, the shuffling of linen, the stirring of limbs long stilled, the unmistakable movement of life awakening where no life should have remained. Gasps escaped the mouths of the mourners. Mary's hand flew to her lips. Martha stepped back in shock. All eyes fixed on the entrance as a figure emerged, bound in burial cloths, his face wrapped, his steps uncertain. Lazarus, alive. Lazarus, returning from death. Lazarus, standing in the light of the world after 4 days in the silence of the grave. A tremor passed through the crowd, not of fear but of awe so profound it seemed to vibrate in the very air. Jesus' voice, calm and gentle, broke the stunned silence. "Unbind him and let him go." The command carried a tenderness that revealed not only power over death, but deep concern for the man who had been its prisoner. Several men rushed forward, their hands trembling as they unwound the linen strips encircling Lazarus's arms and legs. Mary and Martha, unable to contain their emotion, knelt beside their brother, their sobs of relief and joy pouring out like water released from a broken jar. They touched his face, his hands, the living warmth of his skin, unable to comprehend how the brother they had wept over now breathed again, his eyes blinking against the sunlight. Lazarus himself seemed suspended between worlds. His first breaths felt foreign, as though inhaling life for the second time required a moment of adjustment. His heart, once still, now beat with a rhythm that carried the echo of something eternal. He looked at Jesus, his eyes filling with recognition and awe. No words passed between them, but they were not needed. In that silent exchange, Lazarus understood a truth that few would ever grasp, that death was not the final boundary, that friendship with the Son of God carried a mystery beyond human comprehension. The mourners stepped back, some falling to their knees, others covering their faces, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. Some ran to spread the news through Bethany and beyond, their voices shaking with excitement. Others remained in stunned silence, unable to move, unable to speak. For in that moment, the world had changed. The finality of the tomb had been shattered. Hope had taken form in the shape of a man returning from death. And the one who stood before them was revealed not merely as a teacher, not merely as a prophet, but as the very source of life itself. Lazarus, trembling yet alive, leaned into the embrace of his sisters. Their home, once filled with the weight of mourning, would soon overflow with wonder. Yet even as joy poured over them like a flood, something deeper lay beneath the surface, questions that would linger, fears that would rise, and the realization that this miracle, though beautiful, carried consequences none of them could yet foresee. For Lazarus's return from the dead would not bring only celebration. It would bring danger. It would stir hostility. It would place a target upon his life and cast a long shadow over the days to come. But for now, in this tender moment, the family simply held one another, bound by the grace that had restored what was lost. And as we pause here, watching Lazarus step back into the world of the living, one must wonder, what does a man do when he has crossed the boundary of death and returned? As the astonishment of that miracle still hangs in the air like incense, drifting slowly upward, the story now moves into the quiet yet unsettling days that follow Lazarus's return to life. Days in which joy and danger become inseparably intertwined. Bethany, once a village known only to its small circle of neighbors, suddenly found itself transformed into a place of pilgrimage. Word spread with startling speed, carried by every tongue, every road, every traveler who witnessed or heard even fragments of what had happened. Lazarus, whom people had seen buried in the tomb, whom they had mourned with rituals honed by generations, was alive once more, walking among them with breath in his lungs and warmth in his skin. This was no rumor, no exaggeration shaped by excitement. It was truth, undeniable and radiant, shining forth from the most unthinkable corner of human experience. And because it was true, it carried with it both wonder and the silent stirrings of fear. In the immediate days after Lazarus stepped out of the tomb, the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus filled with more people than they had ever imagined. Neighbors came first, their faces pale with awe, some hesitant to approach as though unsure whether Lazarus was truly alive or some vision sent by God. They brought bread, figs, and oil, not out of necessity, but out of the instinctive desire to honor a man who had crossed the boundary none had ever returned from. Lazarus greeted each visitor with gentle humility, still adjusting to the sensation of living again, still feeling as though each breath carried the weight of a mystery too vast to articulate. When he touched a hand extended toward him, when he spoke in the familiar, steady voice that had been silenced by death, the visitors often wept with gratitude or bowed their heads in reverence. Some asked him questions he could not answer. What had he seen? Had he glimpsed the world beyond? Did angels carry him? Did he hear God? Yet Lazarus, with quiet honesty, admitted that his memory of death was veiled, as though wrapped in the same cloth that had once bound his face. He remembered darkness, stillness, and then the voice of Jesus, a voice filled with authority and tenderness, calling him by name. That was enough. As the days passed, visitors came not only from Bethany, but from Jerusalem and other nearby villages. Some came out of curiosity, others out of faith, still others out of deep need, a hope that if Jesus had called Lazarus from the grave, he might heal the suffering that burdened their own families. Mary and Martha, while grateful for the kindness people showed, felt the growing pressure of hosting so many guests. Yet they understood the sacredness of these days, understood that Lazarus's life was now a living testimony, a sign that God had entered their world with power greater than death itself. But as crowds gathered in wonder, something else gathered too. A shadow, subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced. For the miracle that brought joy to so many hearts also stirred deep unease among the leaders in Jerusalem. The chief priests and Pharisees had already been wary of Jesus, concerned that his teachings drew too much attention, that his authority challenged their traditions, that his compassion extended toward those they considered unworthy. But the resurrection of Lazarus pierced through every hesitation, every doubt. This was not a healing that could be debated, not a parable that could be reinterpreted, not a sign that could be dismissed. Lazarus had died, truly died, and now lived. And because he lived, he was a threat. Rumors began to reach Bethany through the whispers of traveling merchants, through disciples who had overheard conversations in Jerusalem, through neighbors who had visited the temple and returned with anxious faces. The chief priests had begun to discuss what they must do, not only about Jesus, but about Lazarus himself. For as long as Lazarus lived, he stood as undeniable proof of Jesus' power, a living witness who turned many hearts toward belief. Those in authority feared that such belief would unsettle the fragile balance between their people and the Roman rulers. They feared unrest, feared loss of influence, feared the possibility that the nation might fracture under the weight of growing hope. And so their thoughts turned, grimly and coldly, toward silencing the witness. Lazarus learned of this danger slowly, piece by piece, in hesitant conversations that surfaced in his home after the visitors departed. At first he felt only bewilderment. How could his life, given back to him by God, be seen as a threat? But as the reality settled in, he felt a heaviness grow within him, not of fear, but of sorrow. He had not asked to return from the dead. He had not sought fame or influence. His only desire had been to live quietly, faithfully, in the companionship of Jesus and the love of his sisters. Yet now the gift he had received carried with it a burden none could have predicted, the burden of being a sign. Mary sensed his unease in the way he grew silent in the evenings, staring at the flicker of the oil lamp as though searching for understanding in its unsteady flame. She sat beside him often, her presence gentle, her prayers whispered so softly they blended with the night air. Martha, though practical and determined, felt her heart twist with concern when she saw how Lazarus's brow furrowed at the mention of Jerusalem. She tried to reassure him with her steadfast confidence, insisting that God, who had restored his life, would not abandon him to danger. Yet beneath her words lay her own trembling awareness that the world had become more complicated than before. Jesus himself understood the shadow gathering around his friend. When he visited Bethany during these days, his gaze carried a deeper solemnity, a sorrow mingled with unwavering purpose. He spoke tenderly to Lazarus, not of fear, but of trust, reminding him that the Father's will, though mysterious, was always shaped by love. These visits, though filled with warmth, held an undercurrent of urgency. Jesus knew what was to come, knew that his own path would soon lead to Jerusalem, to betrayal, to suffering, and ultimately to the cross. And he also knew that Lazarus, by simply living, would be drawn into the unfolding mystery of salvation. In the midst of this tension, Lazarus found himself returning to prayer with renewed depth. He prayed not for safety but for courage, not for escape but for fidelity. He did not understand why God had allowed him to return to life, but he sensed that this new life was not his own to use freely. It was a testimony entrusted to him. And though fear sometimes stirred in his chest, he found peace in the memory of Jesus' voice, calling him from the tomb. That voice, filled with immeasurable love, reassured him that whatever lay ahead would not be faced alone. The people continued to come, and Lazarus welcomed them with humility. Each visitor reminded him that his life now carried a purpose that extended beyond his own understanding. Yet every new gathering also reminded him of the danger that grew silently in the corridors of power. He lived between wonder and threat, between gratitude and sorrow, between the joy of being alive and the weight of what his life represented. And so, as we linger here, in the unfolding tension of these days, we cannot help but ask, what does it mean to be a sign of God's power in a world that fears what it cannot control? As the days following the miracle unfold, like the slow turning of a lantern's glow across a darkened room, the story moves gently into a moment of quiet beauty, a moment in which danger, devotion, and prophetic tenderness meet around a simple table in Bethany. Though rumors continued to swirl throughout Judea, rumors of the authorities who sought to harm Jesus, rumors of the chief priests who whispered of killing Lazarus as well, there came an evening when the household, despite fear and uncertainty, gathered once more to offer hospitality to the one whose presence had become their source of strength. It was 6 days before the Passover, and Jesus, knowing the weight of the days ahead, returned to Bethany one more time, seeking the warmth of the home where love flowed freely, where friendship anchored him amid the rising storm. The meal was prepared with care, though Martha's hands shook occasionally as she mixed the spices and arranged the roasted lamb. She remembered too well the grief that had filled their home only days before, remembered how Jesus had stood before the tomb with tears in his eyes, remembered the moment her brother stepped into sunlight after death had claimed him. These memories shaped her work with a tenderness that deepened every movement. She served Jesus not merely out of duty, but out of profound gratitude, a gratitude that allowed her to place aside her worries, even if only for one evening. The house glowed in the light of oil lamps, their golden flicker reflecting the fragile peace of a family that had learned how quickly life could be altered, restored, and threatened again. Lazarus sat at the table with Jesus and the disciples, though he did so quietly, as though still learning how to inhabit his second life. His presence alone drew the gaze of everyone in the room. Some guests found it difficult to look away from him, for the simple act of watching Lazarus eat, speak, or breathe carried an almost sacred weight. He felt the attention, but did not resent it. He accepted it with humility, knowing that his life now served as a living testimony to the one seated beside him. Jesus, for his part, looked at Lazarus with a gentleness that transcended mere affection. His eyes held a depth of compassion shaped by knowledge that only he possessed, the knowledge of the cross looming ahead, the knowledge of the cost of the miracle he had performed, the knowledge that Lazarus's life now stood at the crossroads of divine revelation and human hostility. Mary moved quietly through the room, her steps soft as though she were treading upon holy ground. She watched Jesus with eyes full of love that did not seek possession or understanding, but simply reflected devotion. From the moment he had first visited their home, Mary had sensed the sacredness in him, not only his power, but his heart. She had listened to his teachings with an openness that allowed them to settle into her soul like seeds that grew in silence. And now, as she saw him seated at their table, she sensed something deeper than before, something both sorrowful and solemn. Jesus carried a weight that no one else could lift, a burden she sensed not in his expression, but in the quiet stillness of his presence. It was in that stillness, in that fragile peace surrounded by shadows, that Mary felt compelled to act. She left the room for a moment and returned with a small alabaster jar held carefully in her hands. The jar, smooth and pale, contained pure nard, a fragrant oil of great value, often reserved for the most sacred of purposes. Martha paused in her serving, sensing the shift in the air. Lazarus lifted his gaze. The disciples quieted their murmurs, and Mary, without speaking a word, knelt beside Jesus. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal of the jar, and with that opening came a fragrance so rich and pure that it filled the entire house within moments. It was the scent of devotion poured without restraint, the scent of love expressed without calculation. Mary tipped the jar and allowed the precious oil to flow over Jesus' feet, anointing them with reverent care. The nard soaked into his skin, glistening in the lamplight, its aroma rising like incense offered upon an altar. Then, in a gesture of humility that stunned everyone present, Mary loosened her hair and wiped his feet with it. Silence fell over the room. It was a silence that held more than surprise. It held awe, tenderness, reverence. Mary's act was not dramatic. It was intimate. It was the expression of a soul that perceived what others could not yet see, that Jesus was moving toward his own suffering, that his days were waning, that love had to be offered now, before the darkness deepened. She anointed him not as a gesture of hospitality, but as a gesture of preparation, as though her hands were participating in a mystery God himself had ordained. Yet not everyone understood. Judas Iscariot, troubled by the cost of the perfume, objected sharply. "Why was this oil not sold and given to the poor?" he demanded, his voice breaking the quiet reverence like a harsh stone thrown into still water. But Jesus turned to him with a calm that silenced every further word. "Leave her alone," he said gently. "She has kept this for the day of my burial." His words, spoken softly, carried a heavy truth. The fragrance that filled the house was more than perfume. It was a foreshadowing. It was a preparation. Mary had anointed him as one would anoint the dead. The weight of his words settled heavily upon the room. Martha bowed her head, tears forming in her eyes as she sensed the sorrow he carried. Lazarus felt a chill pass through him, not of fear, but of recognition. Jesus had given him life, and now he sensed that Jesus himself was moving toward death. Mary, still kneeling, felt her heart ache with a love that had no language to express itself fully. Outside the home, the world was already stirring with tension. Crowds gathered, eager to see Jesus and the man he had raised from the dead. Some came in awe, some with hope, others with suspicion. The chief priests, upon hearing how many were beginning to believe in Jesus because of Lazarus, hardened their resolve. They whispered among themselves, planning not only Jesus' death but Lazarus's as well. It was a chilling thought, that a man could be sought for execution simply because he lived, simply because his very existence bore witness to divine power. But inside the home that evening, none of that mattered. What mattered was the sacredness of the moment, the fragrance of the oil, the warmth of friendship, the quiet exchange of love between Jesus and those who cherished him. It was a moment suspended between joy and grief, between life restored and life soon to be given, between the intimacy of friendship and the unfolding redemption of the world. As the evening drew to a close, Jesus looked at Lazarus, Mary, and Martha with a tenderness that held both blessing and farewell. They did not yet understand the fullness of what lay ahead, but they understood enough to cling to him more tightly, to treasure every word, every gesture, every moment. And as we pause here in the glow of that fragrant evening, we cannot help but wonder, how does love prepare the heart for a sorrow it cannot yet name? As the fragrance of that unforgettable evening fades gently into memory, the story moves into the shadowed hours that draw the world toward Jerusalem, into a time when the tenderness of Bethany gives way to a haunting stillness. Jesus has departed from the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, walking toward the city where prophecy and destiny converge. His steps are steady but solemn, carrying the weight of a mission nearing its culmination. And though Lazarus remains behind in the village for now, His heart strains in the direction of the one who had called him back from death, the one whose path now leads toward suffering. The air itself seems to tremble with anticipation. The hills between Bethany and Jerusalem stand as silent witnesses to the unfolding mystery, their olive branches swaying lightly as though whispering prayers for what is to come. The days that follow Christ's departure are laden with a strange quiet. The crowds that once filled the streets of Bethany begin to thin, for many have traveled into Jerusalem to witness the Passover festivities. Yet beneath the outward busyness of pilgrimage lies a growing tension, a weight that rests upon every conversation, every whispered exchange in the marketplaces, every gathering of men in the temple courts. Those who believe in Jesus speak of hope while watching the authorities with uneasy eyes, uncertain how openly they dare proclaim their faith. Those who oppose him scheme with urgency, knowing that his influence has grown far beyond what they can control. And in this uneasy space between hope and fear, Lazarus finds himself living in a world that feels as though it has been tilted on its axis. He walks through Bethany with a gentleness that seems almost otherworldly, a calm shaped by his time in the tomb, a solemnity touched by the knowledge of life regained. Yet everywhere he goes, he senses the eyes of others upon him, some filled with reverence, others with curiosity, still others with suspicion. Children whisper his name with awe, tracing stories of the miracle with their small hands. Elders nod respectfully when they pass him, their expressions a mixture of wonder and gratitude. Yet amid these signs of affection, there are moments when Lazarus feels the shadow of fear brush against his heart. Snatches of conversation reach him, remarks about the chief priests who are not satisfied with silencing Jesus alone, whispers that Lazarus himself has become a threat simply for existing as proof of Jesus' divine authority. Mary and Martha sense this danger too. They observe the way strangers linger at their door, asking not only about Jesus, but about Lazarus's daily movements, about who visits him, about where he goes. Martha responds with cautious hospitality, serving bread and wine to visitors, but always with her heart alert to the possibility of malice. Mary, in her quiet way, watches with solemn eyes, praying silently each night for her brother's safety. Their home, once a haven of peace and hospitality, now feels like a fragile shelter standing in the path of a gathering storm. The news from Jerusalem grows increasingly troubling. Word spreads that Jesus has been arrested, that he has been betrayed by someone close to him, that he is being tried under the cover of darkness. Lazarus hears these reports with a sorrow so deep it nearly overwhelms him. He sits in the courtyard, his head bowed, his heart aching with a pain he never imagined he would feel again after his own death. It is a strange sorrow, sharp and tender, shaped not by fear, but by profound love. He knows Jesus is innocent. He knows the wisdom and compassion that live within him, knows the tenderness with which he heals, the love with which he teaches, the humility with which he serves. And yet the world, blinded by fear and pride, turns against him. As dawn breaks over Bethany on the day of the crucifixion, Lazarus rises before the sun has fully climbed over the horizon. The air is cool, the light dim, and a heavy silence shrouds the village. Mary and Martha join him in the courtyard, their faces pale with dread. They know what this day could bring. Martha reaches for Lazarus's hand, her grip trembling with emotion she struggles to contain. Mary leans against him, her tears falling softly. Their hearts, once filled with joy at his return, now break anew for the one who gave that joy to them. The hours that follow unfold with a slow, unbearable gravity. though Lazarus does not go into Jerusalem, partly out of danger, partly because his sisters beg him not to risk his life. News travels swiftly. Each report enters the home like a painful echo. Jesus has been condemned. Jesus is carrying the cross. Jesus has fallen beneath its weight. Jesus has been nailed to the wood. Jesus is hanging between thieves. Jesus has spoken his final words. Jesus has breathed his last. Lazarus stands in the center of the courtyard as these words reach him, his heart split open by grief. The man who called him from the grave is now descending into death himself. The one who restored breath to his lungs now gasps for breath upon the cross. The one who embraced him with friendship now hangs alone, abandoned by many of those who once followed him. Lazarus's sorrow is profound, but beneath it lies another deeper ache, a helplessness unlike anything he has ever known. He would give his own life again if it could spare Jesus' suffering, but the path unfolding is one only the Messiah can walk. As the sun begins to set that evening, Mary and Martha prepare their home in silence, lighting lamps not for celebration, but for mourning. The light flickers against the stone walls, casting long shadows that mirror the heaviness in their hearts. Lazarus sits near the threshold, gazing into the fading light, his thoughts drifting toward the moment Jesus called him from the tomb. He recalls the strength of his voice, the warmth of his gaze, the love that filled his presence. He does not understand why Jesus had to suffer, but he clings to the belief that God's purposes, though hidden, are always shaped by mercy. When night fully falls over Bethany, Lazarus feels a deep emptiness settle in his chest. The world feels darker, colder, less certain. Yet even in this sorrow, he senses a faint ember of hope. Fragile, barely visible, but real. Jesus had spoken of rising again. He had spoken of laying down his life only to take it up once more. He had spoken of a kingdom not bound by death. Lazarus knows death intimately. He knows its silence, its stillness, its strange peace. And he knows that if anyone can break its hold, it is the one who broke it once already. For him. As the household gathers in the quiet hours of night, the question that hangs in the air is not spoken aloud, yet it trembles in every heart. When the one who raised the dead now enters the tomb, himself, what hope remains for those who love him? And so we rest here, at the foot of a sorrow too profound for words, wondering what faith looks like when light disappears behind the stone of death. As the heavy grief of that day settles into the quiet corners of Bethany, the story moves gently into a dawn touched by trembling hope, a dawn in which sorrow begins to soften beneath the first whispers of resurrection. For 2 days, the village had lived in a strange, suspended silence, as though the very earth itself grieved the loss of Jesus. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus moved through their home like shadows, their steps slow, their thoughts burdened, their prayers fragmented by sorrow. Lazarus especially felt the ache in a way unlike any other, for he knew the darkness of the tomb, knew the silence that wrapped itself around the dead, knew the stillness that follows the final breath. And now the one who had reached into that darkness to call him out was himself sealed behind the stone of his own grave. It was a sorrow Lazarus could not fully speak, a sorrow shaped by gratitude, by love, by helplessness, and by the lingering memory of a voice that once shattered the silence of death. The morning of the 3rd day arrived without ceremony. The sun rose gently, as it always did, spreading its pale light over the hills and olive trees, over the rooftops of Bethany, over the home that still carried the fragrance of the oil Mary had poured upon Jesus only days before. Martha was the first to rise, her heart heavy but disciplined by years of faith. She prepared a small meal out of habit, more than hunger, knowing that her hands needed something to do lest grief overwhelm her. Mary sat near the doorway, gazing at the road that led to Jerusalem, her eyes soft with sorrow but also alert, as if she expected something she could not name. Lazarus, seated beside her, felt a faint stirring deep within him, a quiet restlessness, a sense that the world was holding its breath. The moment arrived, not in thunder or proclamation, but in hurried footsteps echoing along the road. A woman, breathless, stunned, radiant with fear and joy, ran toward the village, calling out before she even reached the first house. "He is not there! The tomb is empty! The stone has been rolled away!" Her voice, trembling with wonder, broke through the early morning silence like a sudden burst of light. People stepped from their doorways. Heads turned. Conversations stilled. And as she approached the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, her face shone with a wild, holy awe. Mary stood before the woman reached them, her voice soft but urgent. "What do you mean? What have you seen?" The woman, catching her breath, placed her trembling hands against her chest. "The tomb," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I went with the others to anoint his body, but the stone was moved. The guards were gone. His body was not there." She hesitated, as though grasping for words too wondrous to speak aloud. And then 2 angels appeared. They asked why we were weeping. They said, "He is not here. He has risen." At these words, Mary staggered backward, her hand pressed to her face, her knees trembling beneath her. Martha, steadier but equally overwhelmed, reached out to support her sister, her breath escaping in a gasp that sounded half sob, half prayer. Lazarus remained still for a moment, as though the world had stopped turning, as though every memory, every fear, every moment of sorrow had suddenly converged into a single brilliant point of understanding. Jesus had spoken of this. He had foretold his rising. He had promised that death would not hold him. And now, the impossible, something even greater than Lazarus's own return, had come to pass. As the woman continued to speak, describing how Jesus himself had appeared to Mary Magdalene near the tomb, how he had spoken her name with the same warmth he had always carried, how she had recognized him only when her heart was ready to see, the household of Bethany felt their grief dissolve like frost beneath the rising sun. Lazarus closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks, his heart swelling with a peace so profound it seemed to illuminate every shadow within him. Mary leaned against the doorway, her tears flowing freely, her prayers rising from her lips in a trembling whisper of gratitude. Martha knelt, bowing her head to the ground, her heart overflowing with the certainty that God had fulfilled his promise in a way far greater than she had ever imagined. Yet even in their joy, the news carried a trembling sense of awe. Jesus had risen, but he had not yet come to Bethany. He appeared to the women, to his disciples, to those whose hearts were open in those early hours. For Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, this created a strange mixture of longing and hope, a desire to see him again, to hear his voice, to feel once more the presence that had shaped every corner of their lives. They waited together, listening for footsteps, listening for his greeting, listening for the familiar warmth of his approach. In the days that followed, more news arrived from Jerusalem. Jesus had appeared to the disciples behind locked doors. He had walked with 2 travelers along the road to Emmaus, revealing the meaning of the scriptures as he broke bread with them. He had shown Thomas his wounds, inviting him to touch the marks of nails and spear, inviting him to believe. Each report, carried by breathless messengers and trembling witnesses, filled Bethany with wonder and deepened the faith of all who heard. The resurrection was not a rumor. It was not a whispered hope. It was a living truth, unfolding in real encounters, reshaping lives one by one. Lazarus, though living quietly within the village, felt the meaning of this mystery in a way uniquely his own. When he heard of Jesus appearing to the disciples, he felt a deep resonance echo through his heart, as though the one who had once called him from the tomb had now shattered the gates of death from within. The difference between his own return to life and Jesus' resurrection became unmistakably clear. Lazarus had been restored to earthly life, still subject to suffering, still marked by mortality. Jesus had risen into a life beyond death, a glorified eternal life that transformed every sorrow into hope. Lazarus felt humbled, awed, and deeply moved by this truth. Jesus had not simply reversed death, he had conquered it completely. Mary, whose contemplative heart carried her swiftly toward spiritual insight, sensed that the resurrection was not only a victory, but a gift. A gift meant to heal the sorrow that had pierced them. A gift meant to assure them that love is stronger than death. She spent her days in prayer, thanking God for this miracle, allowing the rising hope to reshape the sorrow she had carried so heavily. Martha, with her practical wisdom and unshakable devotion, opened her home once more to neighbors who came seeking understanding, offering bread and comfort as she spoke of the resurrection, with a clarity grounded in faith. And yet, amid all these blessings, one quiet question began to take form in their hearts. Would Jesus return to see them once more before his ascension? They longed to look upon his face, to hear his voice assure them that the path ahead, though filled with uncertainty, was guided by his love. They longed for the comfort of his presence, the steadying peace that only he brought. But they also understood that his mission now extended far beyond Bethany. He had risen not for them alone, but for the world. And so they waited, not with impatience, but with a hopeful trust shaped by all he had taught them. As days turned to weeks, Lazarus walked often to the hill overlooking Jerusalem. There he prayed, gazing toward the city where the greatest mystery of all had unfolded. He prayed in gratitude, in humility, in wonder. And though Jesus did not return to Bethany in those days, Lazarus felt his presence in every breath of wind, in every turn of light, in every memory of his voice. He knew, with a certainty deeper than words, that the resurrection had changed not only history, but the very fabric of his heart. And so we pause here, in the gentle dawning of new life, wondering how a man who has known death twice, first in the tomb and then in grief, experiences the world when hope itself has risen from the grave. As the quiet glow of resurrection continues to warm the hills of Judea, the story moves gently into a new chapter of Lazarus's life, one shaped by both awe and unease, by the widening circle of Christian hope and the tightening grip of political threat. In the weeks after Jesus rose from the dead, Bethany found itself transformed once more, though in a manner far more complex than during the days following Lazarus's return from the tomb. Joy pulsed through the hearts of many, joy rooted not in rumor, but in living testimony, in the voices of disciples who had seen the risen Christ with their own eyes, in the trembling accounts of women whose tears of grief had become tears of astonished wonder. Yet along with this joy came a thickening atmosphere of danger, a subtle tightening of unseen cords, as though the powers of the world sensed the shifting of spiritual ground beneath their feet. For Lazarus, these days were marked by a tenderness that carried both gratitude and sorrow. He woke each morning with a heart overflowing at the thought that Jesus lived eternally, that the darkness of the tomb had not held him, that the suffering of the cross had given way to victorious life. Yet with this gratitude came an uneasy awareness that the miracle of Jesus' resurrection had placed all who loved him in a perilous position. The authorities, already shaken by Lazarus' return from death, now wrestled with a new and greater fear, that the risen Jesus would lead a movement too powerful to contain, a movement that would upend the fragile balance between Rome and Judea, a movement fueled by miracles that defied every human expectation. At first, Lazarus tried to remain in Bethany, caring for Mary and Martha, tending to the familiar paths and olive groves that had been the backdrop of their lives. But it soon became clear that staying would bring more danger than safety. Whispers grew louder, whispers from merchants returning from Jerusalem, whispers from neighbors who had overheard the priests speaking in tense, urgent tones, whispers from friends who now avoided lingering in public with Lazarus for fear of drawing attention. The chief priests, frustrated by the uncontainable spread of belief, began to consider measures not only against the disciples, but also against Lazarus himself. Some suggested arresting him quietly, others hinted at a fate more final. The thought of killing him, again, circulated in dark corners of the temple, spoken in low voices by those who saw his life as a living contradiction to their denial of Christ. Mary and Martha felt this threat like a tightening grip around their hearts. They whispered worriedly in the evenings, their faces pale with fear, their hands trembling as they closed the shutters. They urged Lazarus to avoid the public roads, to remain close to home, to pray for guidance. Lazarus, though troubled, remained calm. He knew that his life was no longer his own to protect. It had been given back to him for a purpose he could not fully understand, and if danger now followed him, he accepted it with the quiet dignity of one who had already faced death and knew its silence well. But even with this inner peace, he could not ignore the danger threatening his sisters. He saw the worry etched into Martha's determined gaze, saw the fear behind Mary's contemplative silence. And so he began to pray, not for safety, but for clarity. He sought the still, steady voice of God in the quiet hours of dawn, asking what he must do, where he must go, how he should live the second life he had been given. The answer did not come in thunder or vision, but in a deep, persistent stirring of the heart, a sense that he must leave Bethany for a time, that he must allow the early church to grow without the shadow of his presence drawing the fury of the authorities. It was around this time that the disciples, who had begun to gather in small, secret communities, quietly urged Lazarus to seek refuge elsewhere. Some suggested Galilee, others spoke of regions beyond Judea, places where Roman presence was strong, but where Jewish authorities held less sway. There were whispers of Cyprus, an island known for its diversity, its ports, its relative safety for those fleeing persecution. Some even spoke of regions farther west, across the sea, where Jewish communities lived peacefully in foreign lands. But Lazarus did not decide quickly. His heart felt torn between the home he loved and the mission he sensed gathering like a distant horizon. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Mount of Olives and painted the sky in pale gold and rose, Lazarus sat with Mary and Martha in the courtyard. The olive branches swayed softly overhead, casting shifting shadows across the ground. Martha spoke first, her voice steady, though her eyes glistened. "You must go," she said gently, placing her hand on her brother's arm. "Not because we want you to leave, but because staying will bring harm to you and to all who come near our home. We cannot protect you from what the leaders plan, but God can guide you where we cannot." Mary nodded, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. "Jesus restored you for a purpose," she whispered, "and perhaps that purpose is not here. Perhaps you are meant to bear witness somewhere his name has not yet reached." Her words, tender and trembling, settled into Lazarus's heart with the weight of truth. He knew she was right. He knew Martha was right. He felt the inner confirmation of their words, the same steady peace that had filled him when Jesus had called him from the darkness of the tomb. And so the decision was made. Not quickly, not easily, but with the quiet certainty of faith. Lazarus would leave Bethany, carrying with him not only the memory of Jesus' voice, but the truth of his resurrection. Mary and Martha would remain, anchoring the home that had become a sanctuary for early believers, offering hospitality and wisdom to those seeking to understand the teachings of Christ. Their roles, though separated, would remain woven together by the same love that had bound them to Jesus from the beginning. In the days that followed, preparations were made quietly. Friends came to offer guidance, maps, provisions, and the addresses of families who would welcome Lazarus in distant places. Martha, who expressed love through action, packed food for the journey, wrapped garments with careful hands, and ensured that Lazarus had everything he might need for months on the road. Mary, who expressed love through contemplation, wove her prayers into every step he would take, asking God to surround him with grace, to guide his footsteps, to shield him from danger, to deepen his witness. The night before Lazarus's departure, the house was filled with a stillness that felt both heavy and holy. The siblings prayed together, their voices soft, their tears unhidden. They spoke of Jesus, of his teachings, of his love, of the hope he had given them. Lazarus, feeling the weight of the journey ahead, held their hands and whispered gratitude for the sisters who had shaped his life with unwavering devotion. And in the quiet hours before dawn, he gazed at the horizon and felt a stirring of purpose, a feeling that his leaving was not a loss, but the beginning of a pilgrimage shaped by the call of God. As morning broke, Lazarus stepped onto the road leading out of Bethany, his heart steady, his spirit open, his life once again entrusted to the God who had carried him from death into new life. And as we accompany him in these first steps of exile, one question rises gently like the morning light. What does it mean for a man returned from death to become a witness in lands far from home, carrying the quiet weight of a miracle the world still struggles to comprehend? As the soft light of dawn rests upon the road stretching away from Bethany, the story moves gently into a season of wandering, a pilgrimage shaped not by certainty, but by obedience. Lazarus walks with the slow, steady steps of one who has learned the fragility of life and the mystery of God's timing. He carries nothing excessive, only what Martha prepared with practical care, what Mary blessed with quiet tears, and what his own heart holds with reverent humility. The air is cool in the early hours, scented with the earthiness of olive groves and distant fig trees. Behind him lies the home where he once lived, died, and lived again. Ahead lies a path unwritten, carrying him into lands where the memory of Jesus has not yet taken root, where his testimony will be met with wonder, skepticism, or even disbelief. At first, Lazarus travels through familiar hills and valleys, moving cautiously through villages where whispers of danger still linger. He keeps his cloak close and his steps measured, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. He knows that drawing attention to himself could bring harm to those who show him hospitality. Yet even as he moves quietly, he cannot hide the peace that radiates from him. There is something in his gaze, something in the steady calm of his presence, that draws the curiosity of strangers. Some feel compelled to ask where he is headed. Others simply sense that he carries a story too sacred to be spoken casually. After several days of travel, Lazarus reaches the coastal region near Joppa, The sea, with its vast rhythmic breathing, greets him like a great mystery, shimmering beneath the sunlight as waves break gently against the shore. He stands there for a long moment, gazing at the horizon, remembering the stories Jesus told of fishermen called into discipleship, of storms calmed with a single word, of faith tested and renewed upon these waters. Though he had been more accustomed to the quiet hills of Judea, Lazarus feels a deep stirring as he looks upon the sea, a sense that this wide, open expanse will be part of the path God has chosen for him. It is near Joppa that Lazarus finds refuge in the home of a Jewish family who welcome travelers. The father of the household, a man named Ezra, recognizes something unusual in Lazarus's demeanor. Over the course of an evening meal, as bread is shared and lamps flicker with soft light, Ezra gently inquires about his journey. Lazarus speaks humbly, avoiding dramatic language, simply sharing that he is traveling for the sake of the one who showed him great mercy. Ezra, though not fully understanding, listens with respect. He offers not only food, but guidance, pointing Lazarus toward the ports where ships set sail for Cyprus, a land known for its diverse people and its openness to travelers fleeing danger. Mary's prayers, carried silently in Lazarus's heart, seem to accompany him with every step. Martha's careful provisions sustain him as the days stretch into weeks. By the time he boards a small merchant vessel bound for Cyprus, Lazarus feels both the weight of exile and the grace that guides it. The sea wind brushes against his face as the ship cuts through the water, and he finds himself reflecting on the life he has lived, on the first breath he drew after returning from the tomb, on the warmth of Jesus' gaze, on the sorrow of the cross, and on the astonished joy of hearing that he had risen. Each memory settles into him like a stone placed gently into the foundation of a building yet to be constructed. His story is no longer his alone. It belongs to the one who restored him, and it belongs to every soul who might, through hearing it, draw closer to faith. The journey across the sea is both peaceful and unnerving. Nights bring a cathedral of stars stretching above him, their brilliance reflected on the water's glassy surface. Days bring the creaking of wooden planks, the cries of seabirds, the murmurs of sailors weaving stories of distant lands. Lazarus listens, observes, prays. He senses that every moment of this journey, even the seeming stillness, is part of a deeper preparation. He feels small upon the vast sea, yet not abandoned. He feels vulnerable, yet protected. He feels, above all, called. Upon reaching Cyprus, Lazarus steps onto soil that feels both foreign and strangely welcoming. The island is alive with color, its hills dotted with vineyards and pomegranate trees, its markets bustling with voices speaking in languages that weave together like threads of an intricate tapestry. He moves carefully at first, guided by the names and places given to him by Ezra. It does not take long before he finds refuge in the quiet home of a small community of believers who had heard whispers of Jesus' resurrection, but had not yet met anyone who witnessed his power firsthand. When they learn that Lazarus is the very man Jesus raised from the dead, they respond with awe, reverence, and tears of gratitude. Yet Lazarus does not present himself as someone extraordinary. He speaks not of himself, but of Jesus, of his compassion, his teachings, his miracles, his willingness to enter human sorrow, his triumphant rising from the grave. He shares what he remembers not as grand declarations, but as a friend speaking of another friend, as someone who has walked in the shadow of death and found light waiting on the other side. He does not dramatize his story. He offers it gently, allowing the listeners to receive its truth at their own pace, trusting that the Spirit of God will awaken understanding where his words alone cannot. Over time, the believers in Cyprus begin to look to Lazarus as a spiritual father. His humility draws them. His gentleness comforts them. His quiet strength steadies them. And though he never sought leadership, he finds himself guiding others with the wisdom of a soul who has encountered God in the most intimate of ways. He teaches not with eloquence, but with presence. He teaches not with authority, but with authenticity. He teaches not by insisting, but by embodying a peace that only comes from surrender to the love of Christ. Yet even as he begins to find a place of rest in Cyprus, the shadow of danger still lingers in the back of his mind. He knows that the same forces that sought to silence him in Judea may one day seek him here. He knows that exile offers no absolute safety, but he also knows that fear cannot shape the mission God has entrusted to him. His life belongs to God, and every breath he draws is a testimony to divine mercy. And so he lives with a paradoxical freedom, aware of danger, yet unbound by it, mindful of mortality, yet unafraid of it, anchored not by place, but by purpose. In his prayers, Lazarus often asks God for the strength to live this second life with faithfulness. He prays for Mary and Martha, imagining them continuing their quiet ministry in Bethany. He prays for the disciples who carry the gospel into lands far beyond Judea. He prays for those who listen to his story, that they may come to know Jesus not only as healer, but as Lord, not only as friend, but as Savior. And as he walks through the vineyards of Cyprus, as he kneels in prayer beside the sea, as he sits with those seeking comfort and truth, Lazarus begins to understand something profound, that exile, though painful, is not the absence of God's plan. It is the unfolding of it. His life, once ordinary, has become a quiet thread woven into a tapestry far larger than he could ever have imagined. And so we pause here, watching Lazarus take root in a new land, carrying the weight and the wonder of his calling. One cannot help but ponder. How does a man who has lived twice become a shepherd of souls in a place far from home, guided by nothing but faith, memory, and the echo of a divine voice? As the gentle rhythm of life in Cyprus settles around him like a warm cloak, the story moves into the later years of Lazarus's journey. Years shaped less by wandering and more by the steady responsibility of shepherding souls. The small Christian community that first received him in trembling wonder soon becomes a flourishing gathering of believers, strengthened by his presence, comforted by his humility, and guided by the wisdom he never claims as his own. Lazarus, once the quiet man of Bethany who lived in the shadow of his sister's gifts, now finds himself entrusted with a spiritual role he had never imagined. The people look to him not because of the miracle that restored his life, but because of the depth of faith that radiates from him, the depth that came from living through death twice and discovering that love endures beyond every darkness. It is said in ancient tradition that Lazarus became a bishop in Cyprus, a shepherd not by ambition, but by vocation. His leadership is unlike that of many others. He does not carry himself with authority. He carries himself with tenderness. His homespun garments and gentle expression remind the people of the simple love Jesus showed in Bethany when he rested beneath the olive trees and shared meals at their humble table. When Lazarus teaches, he speaks quietly, with a voice that still bears the soft cadence of Judea, a voice shaped by years of silence both in the tomb and in contemplation. But when he speaks the name of Jesus, something in his tone shifts, as though a brightness enters the room, as though the very memory of Christ fills the air with warmth. He teaches the community about the heart of Christ's mission, not through sermons heavy with rhetoric, but through stories. Stories of Martha bustling through their home, insisting on feeding the Lord. Stories of Mary at his feet, listening with a heart open to eternity. Stories of himself sitting beside Jesus in the courtyard, absorbing the quiet wisdom that flowed as naturally from him as water from a spring. He tells of Jesus weeping at the tomb, his tears falling upon the earth like beads of divine compassion. And though the resurrection he experienced is the miracle people long to hear about most, Lazarus speaks of it with a humility that astonishes them. He tells it not with dramatic flourish, but with tremor and reverence, as though the memory remains too sacred to handle carelessly. When children gather around him, he tells them not of the darkness of the tomb, but of the first thing he heard when life returned to him. Jesus' voice calling his name with a tenderness that banished every shadow. It was the voice of love, Lazarus tells them softly, the voice that knows every sorrow, every longing, every fear. It was the voice that brings life where there is none. The children listen in wonder, their eyes wide, sensing that they are being entrusted with something holy. Lazarus's presence strengthens the early church in ways he cannot fully perceive. His gentle leadership empowers others to serve. His compassion anchors those facing persecution. His humility keeps the community grounded. In times of distress, when rumors spread of unrest on the mainland, or when fear begins to grip those who remember the hostility of their former homes, Lazarus becomes a calming presence. He gathers the believers for prayer, guiding them to lift their hearts to God with trust rather than trembling. When the poor come seeking help, he offers not only bread but blessing. When widows and orphans approach the door, he invites them inside without question, remembering how Jesus embraced those on the margins. Yet Lazarus is not without his own struggles. Though he rarely speaks of it, there are moments when he sits alone beneath the stars, gazing over the quiet sea, and feels the deep ache of longing for Bethany, for the warmth of Mary's contemplative spirit, for Martha's practical affection, for the familiar hills and olive groves of his childhood. He lifts them in prayer each night, entrusting them to the care of God, knowing that their paths too have been shaped by Jesus' love. But his longing does not become sorrow. Instead, it becomes a thread woven into his spiritual life, a reminder that the heart remains open to love even across distance, even across time. In these quiet evenings of solitude, Lazarus sometimes reflects on the mystery of his second life. He wonders why God chose him for such a miracle. Why him, a simple man with no prophetic lineage, no scholarly accomplishments, no natural authority? The answer remains hidden from him, yet he finds peace in knowing that God's ways are shaped not by human logic, but by divine love. Perhaps his very simplicity made him the perfect vessel for a miracle, meant to reveal God's tenderness. Perhaps the intimacy of his friendship with Jesus made his resurrection not a demonstration of raw power, but a sign of the personal love God offers to each soul. As the years pass, the community in Cyprus grows. New believers arrive from distant ports, carrying stories of persecutions, conversions, visions, and wonders happening throughout the spreading Christian world. Lazarus listens to each account with the humble heart of a shepherd who knows that God is moving in ways far beyond his small island. He rejoices when he hears of Paul's letters reaching communities across the Mediterranean, of Peter's steadfast preaching, of John's profound reflections on the love of Christ. Though he never sees the apostles again, their names remain dear to him, woven into his prayers like cherished melodies. But with age comes weariness. Lazarus begins to walk slower, to rest more often. His beard grows white, his face lined with the gentle creases of decades lived in grace and service. Yet the spark in his eyes, the quiet light shaped by resurrection, never dims. Children who once gathered for stories now bring their own little ones to sit at his feet. Widows who found comfort in his prayers now comfort him in his declining strength. And the faithful, who once leaned on him for guidance, now gather to honor the shepherd who gave them so much of his heart. One evening, as Lazarus sits beneath a fig tree watching the last light fade from the horizon, he feels a deep peace settle over him. The air is cool, the world quiet, and he senses that his final days are drawing near. Unlike the first time he faced death, he feels no fear. He knows the silence of the tomb, yes, but he also knows the voice that breaks through that silence. He trusts that voice completely. He smiles softly, resting his hands upon his knees, and whispers a prayer not of petition, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the gift of life restored, for the love of his sisters, for the companionship of the early church, for the privilege of being a witness to Christ's glory. When the moment finally comes, it arrives not with struggle, but with serenity. Lazarus closes his eyes, his breathing slows, and his soul, freed from the weariness of age, slips gently into the embrace of God. Those gathered around him, brothers and sisters of faith, children he had blessed, widows he had comforted, feel the peace that fills the room. They know this is not the wrenching grief of loss, but the quiet conclusion of a long journey shaped by miracles, exile, devotion, and grace. And so we pause here, honoring the humble bishop whose life bridged death and eternity, wondering what legacy remains when a man who has lived twice finally finds his lasting rest. As the gentle hush that follows Lazarus's final breath settles over the quiet home in Cyprus, the story moves into its closing chapter, one in which the mystery of his life begins to unfold into the greater mystery of legacy. His passing, unlike the violent grief that once filled the house in Bethany, carries an atmosphere of profound peace. Those gathered around him feel not the crushing weight of despair, but the deep, steady calm of a soul returning to the one who had twice given him life. The room feels touched by something beyond human language, a stillness that is not emptiness but presence, as though Christ himself draws near to welcome his friend home. Tears fall, yes, but they fall gently, like dew upon the morning earth. Those who knew Lazarus intimately sense that this is not an ending but a beginning, not a closing of the story, but its unfolding into eternity. Word spreads quickly through the Christian communities of Cyprus. Believers arrive from distant villages, bringing simple offerings of flowers, oil, and woven cloth to honor the shepherd who guided them with such humility. They speak softly of his kindness, his wisdom, the steadiness that radiated from him in moments of fear. Some recall how his prayers comforted them in times of loss. Others share memories of evenings when he taught them about the Jesus he loved, the Jesus who wept, who healed, who prayed, who rose. Children, now grown, remember how he told stories beneath the fig tree, stories that shaped their earliest understanding of God's love. And though each person brings a different memory, they all speak of one truth. Lazarus lived as a man whose heart had been shaped by grace. His presence itself had been a kind of sanctuary. His burial takes place not with elaborate ceremonies, but with the reverent simplicity that defined his life. The believers lay him in a small stone chamber near the sea, a quiet place where the wind moves gently through the olive branches and the waves brush softly against the shore. They sing psalms with trembling voices, their harmonies rising like incense toward heaven. Some recall the words Jesus spoke at Lazarus's first tomb, "I am the resurrection and the life." These words, once uttered to call him back into the world, now offer hope as he steps finally toward eternity. In the days that follow, the community feels his absence in ways both tender and sharp. They miss his calm presence, his listening heart, the gentle authority with which he blessed their children, the quiet strength with which he guided them through persecutions and uncertainties. But as they gather for prayer, they also sense a curious nearness, as though Lazarus now accompanies them in spirit with an even deeper compassion than before. They speak of him not with sorrow, but with affection shaped by hope. His life, once so intimately tied to Jesus' earthly ministry, now becomes a thread in the vast tapestry of the early church's unfolding story. News of his passing eventually reaches the mainland, carried by travelers and merchants, by sailors crossing between ports, by believers who journey between distant communities. When the story reaches Bethany, Mary and Martha are older now, their hair streaked with silver, their hands shaped by years of hospitality and prayer. The message arrives in a simple letter carried by a Christian pilgrim who had once visited Cyprus. As the sisters unroll the scroll and read the words written with affection and reverence, their faces soften with both grief and gratitude. They had known, deep in their hearts, that Lazarus's time on earth had been long, longer than most could ever hope for. They had prayed for his peace and had asked God to receive him gently when the time came. And now they learned that he passed in serenity, surrounded by believers who loved him as they once did. Mary presses the scroll to her chest, her eyes lifting heavenward in silent thanksgiving. Martha sits beside her, tears falling freely but without anguish, her hands clasped together in prayer. They speak softly to one another, recalling memories of their childhood with Lazarus, of meals shared, of the miracle that once changed their lives, of the years of separation softened by hope. They know that Lazarus is now with Jesus, the friend who had called him by name, the Savior who had conquered death, the Lord who had loved him with a tenderness that defied the boundaries of time and mortality. This knowledge brings them peace deeper than any comfort the world could offer. In the Christian imagination, Lazarus's legacy begins to take shape not as a figure of dramatic triumph, but as a figure of quiet endurance. He becomes, in the hearts of believers, a symbol of the hope that lies at the core of the gospel, the hope that death is not the final word, that suffering is not the end of the story, that every soul is held in the gentle hands of a God who knows us by name. The story of Lazarus is told not only in the Scriptures, but in gatherings of early Christians who seek courage in persecution, who long for reassurance in their own moments of doubt, who look to his life as a reminder that the love of Christ extends even into the silence of the tomb. Some speak of visions seen in prayer, of Lazarus appearing beside the risen Christ, his face illuminated by a peace deeper than earthly joy. Others speak of miracles attributed to his intercession, moments of healing, of comfort granted to the dying, of courage stirred in the hearts of those facing trials. Whether these stories are literal or symbolic matters little to those who hear them. What matters is the truth they convey, that Lazarus's life, touched so profoundly by Jesus, continues to bear fruit long after his earthly journey ends. In Cyprus, the place of his burial becomes a site of quiet pilgrimage. People come not seeking dramatic signs, but seeking the gentle peace they associate with him. They kneel near the stone chamber, listening to the sound of the sea, whispering prayers that rise from hearts full of longing. They ask for courage to face their own sorrows. They ask for hope in moments of fear. And many report leaving with a strange lightness in their hearts, a sense of being understood by someone who knew both the darkness of death and the warmth of divine love. Lazarus's legacy also reaches future generations through the stories preserved by the early church. Writers speak of his humility, his friendship with Jesus, his role in shaping the Christian communities in Cyprus. Artists depict him stepping out of the tomb at Christ's command, his face filled with wonder and awe. Hymns are composed in his honor, celebrating not only the miracle of his resurrection, but the quiet sanctity of his later years. His feast day becomes a moment in the liturgical year when believers reflect on the mystery of life, death, and the resurrection promised to all who place their trust in Christ. Over time, Lazarus becomes a symbol not only of divine power, but of divine tenderness. He reminds the faithful that God's miracles are not always loud or dramatic, that sometimes they unfold in the stillness of one soul transformed, in the quiet witness of a life lived in gratitude. His story whispers a truth that every believer longs to hear, that we are known, we are loved, and we are called by name into the fullness of life. And as we draw this journey to its close, one question gently remains, lingering like the last note of a hymn carried on the evening breeze. In our own moments of sorrow and hope, how might we listen for the voice that once called Lazarus from the darkness, the voice that still calls each soul toward life, light, and the eternal embrace of God?